What is the best way to train your glutes? My name is Coach Andrew Menechian and I'm going to take you through that right now. Firstly, when we have a look at the glutes, they are the biggest muscle in the human body and the thing they're most responsible for is hip extension. So when we think about the glutes, we just try to look at it through two simple ways. We've got the upper and lower glutes. Upper glutes are more so responsible for hip adduction and lower glutes are more so responsible for hip extension. When we talk about the upper glutes, we want to make sure we're developing them because if we don't have them, when we look at them from behind, we have a hip dip. Now, there's four main ways that we want to be training the glutes. And when we train them in these four ways, we're hitting them in all possible angles. So the first one is hip extension. Now, this is your hip thrust, your glute bridge, etc. And they hit both the upper and lower parts of the glutes. Next would be a squat or lunge pattern. An example would be a lunge, a reverse lunge, a Bulgarian split squat, a squat, etc. And what these do is hit mainly the lower glutes and your quads. Next would be a hinge or pull pattern. An example would be a deadlift, hyperextension, B-stance deadlift, etc. Lastly, we would have a hip abduction pattern. An example for those would be a side lying hip abduction, cable hip abduction, etc. What we want to make sure we're doing is hitting all of these different types of exercises. Now, some people can get away with just doing squats and deadlifts because they have great muscle activation, genetics, etc. But a lot of people need to be doing all of these different things to optimally grow the glutes. So when we look at these exercises, the reason that we need to train all of these different types is because they train the glutes in a different way. When we look at any muscle group, we want to be training them in a stretch position, a mid position, and a shortened position. When you're doing your squats and deadlifts, you're hitting it in pretty good angles, but we're not optimizing the extremes of one way. And what we want to do is to optimize it in the extremes. So when we look at a hip thrust, it's a max contractor position. So you can't really contract the glutes much more than that with heavy load and optimize that exercise. And when we look at, say, a Romanian deadlift, we're training the glutes in a stretch position. So we can't really train it in much more of a stretch position than that. But we want to make sure that we're doing both exercises. Now, the reason that this is important is because most people don't think to consider to train it in both ways. And if you're not, you're limiting yourself to one part of the exercise and you're not optimizing that full range of motion and getting strong in both sections. So when you look at that hip thrust, it's hard at the top, right? So it's the hardest at the top of the movement. And when we look at a Romanian deadlift, it's the hardest at the bottom of the movement, which means we're training the glutes in two different types of positions, which is optimal for growth. Now, ideally, we want to be doing at least one exercise from each of these different types of movements. And I'm going to take you through a few different examples of these right now.
We're going to start with a hip extension movement, and I've chosen the single leg dumbbell hip thrust. Now with this, we've got the bottom of our scapula at the edge of the bench. We're tucking our chin forward, which is very important to make sure that we don't arch our lower back. And at the top of the movement, we're trying to make sure that our shin is as vertical as possible. We're trying to focus on driving the glutes up as opposed to lifting ourselves over the bench on this movement. Next up, we've got the squat lunge pattern, and for this I've chosen a dumbbell deficit reverse lunge. I'm leaning slightly forward on this movement to emphasize the glutes, and I'm also trying to keep my shins vertical so that way I can focus more on hitting the glutes, whereas if my knee was traveling further forward, this would be more of a quad-based movement. Now we have the hinge or pull pattern. For this one, I've chosen the B-stance Romanian deadlift. When we're doing this movement, you want to think of this like a hip extension. So try not to think lowering your upper body down. Imagine driving your hips back and pushing your hips forward. As you can see, also on this movement, the shin is as vertical as possible to keep the majority of the weight on the posterior chain or the hamstrings and glutes. Finally, we have the hip abduction. For this, I've chosen to do it with the cable. One of the reasons being is because you can get more range of motion. As you can see, my right leg is going past my left leg to get a full range of motion for the hip abduction. On this movement, you want to be pushing out to the side and slightly backwards, and you should be feeling this in the upper glutes or the glute med.
Alright guys, they are my favorite tips to help you to get your glutes to grow in the best way possible. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. Let me know in the comments if there's any questions that you have or if there's any topics that you want me to cover. I will see you guys next time.